We live in an increasingly combative world. Man versus woman, Republican versus Democrat, every ethnicity versus every race, just all kinds of different factions constantly duking it out. And not that I like all the antagonism, but I did come up with an additional divide that could or should be fighting with one another. And before I get too deep into this idea, I need to bounce it off of somebody. Welcome back to the T-Rex Talk podcast, and today I have as guest David Botkin, who has been on the podcast many times. In fact, you were on the podcast in the early days when it was still on the main T-Rex YouTube channel. Then we spent a couple of years being a YouTube-free podcast on Spotify and on iTunes and all the other places where you can still get the podcast. But this is the first time we're back on YouTube on our own YouTube channel. So we're going to try something a little bit new and different. In the past, if you've listened to the podcast before, occasionally we would have interviews and occasionally we'd have monologues. Monologues are boring. So we're going to try a new thing, which is a conversation about an idea. I have an idea that I have not told to David. I'm going to get his thoughts on it. We'll discuss it live. So it won't feel like a monologue. It'll feel like a conversation. You'll have that fun back and forth that YouTube podcasters like to generate artificially. We're going to see if it happens naturally.
It could also be me being confused and trying to figure out what you're talking about.
It could happen naturally.
Yeah.
It could happen artificially. We'll see. So in the past, we have talked on the podcast about Marxist revolutions in history, which generally start with a need for instability and a need for resentment. So you got to take what exists, the status quo, and you got to get people divided against one another. Can you think of some examples just off the top of your head, being the historian that you are?
Well, it's not just communist groups that do this.
It is human nature.
You have this with the French Revolution. You have this in various chunks of the communist revolution in Russia.
Yeah.
You have all these different people splitting each other into groups and drawing lines and creating haves or have-nots or whatever the line is.
Yeah. And now the big one in the 21st century is ostensibly oppressor versus oppressed. And this is a super handy one because sometimes the rich versus poor is the classic Marxist one. Even the French Revolution is pre-communism, but it was aristocrats versus common people. It was rich versus poor. That's a super effective one because it builds into your existing envy. If you are, if there's anybody, if Elon Musk is richer than you, then you have a dog in the fight. You get to be jealous.
Yeah. So wealth is a super common dividing line, and then racial lines.
Racial is easy. Yeah.
And religious lines are really easy.
Yeah.
So like in Ireland, a lot of their lines with the Troubles have been around religious lines.
Yeah. So there's an interesting thing that's happening because oppressor versus oppressed is handy because you can put people into the oppressed bucket.
Yeah.
And you can create new intersections of intersectionality. So that's kind of handy. And it lets you combine racial and religious and economic buckets together based on people that you specifically want to target or specifically want to appeal to for a vote, for example. So it's a great way of taking like Mexican immigrants who are hardcore Catholics and making them vote against people with a similar religious bent, for example.
Yeah.
It's a really handy thing for people who want to create division and unrest and challenge the status quo.
There's this new thing I've read a little bit about called all one thingism.
Yeah.
And it seems like that the core of that, and I've only read a couple articles, so I'm super green on this and not an authority at all, but it seems
Well,
like
you're talking on a podcast, so yes,
right,
you are.
so I'm totally qualified because it's a podcast to speak. But it seems like that oppressor-oppression thing is the basis, and that's how you can get these groups that ideologically have nothing in common.
Yeah.
But they're all oppressed by someone somewhere, and therefore it's all one thing.
Right. So the premise of this podcast, my pitch that I would have written out into a complicated monologue, and it would have been way less fun than a back and forth, is there is another divide that is emerging, but accidentally. This isn't something that I believe has been planned out, but it is a naturally occurring division between, and this is going to sound insulting, but I don't care, competent and incompetent. So now when you think about it, there's always a spectrum. There's always going to be people who are more competent than others, wealthier than others, et cetera. It's going to happen. In geographic areas, you're going to have racial divides, and it's always going to be kind of a spectrum. And in many cases, these people can be either natural allies or natural enemies, like rich versus poor. What could be better than rich people starting businesses and hiring poor people to work in them, and then all the boats get lifted? Or what could be better than creating natural enmity between these two groups so that you can divide the country and get your socialist revolution going? Competence and incompetence is the same way. Like, what could be better? Well, who could be better allies than people who have something to teach and people who want to learn stuff than the competent and the incompetent? But if your divide gets too far apart, they no longer are on the same page. They can't even communicate with each other. And when I say incompetent people, I could be talking about literally anything, but I'm kind of thinking about like bureaucrats in government, teachers, academia, people who are separated from the real world. The things that they're good at are things that are not connected to the real world.
They're not building bridges physically or literally or figuratively.
Yeah. And it's kind of a fuzzy concept because it could be anything else. It could be other stuff. Like there are people who are very competent at building YouTube channels. If you look at the number of people watching this video, that's not us. Other people are really good at that, but then you could argue that's not really a marketable skill. There's a way in which competence that is tied to the real world builds up.
Right.
And there are ways in which I see natural alliances developing between people who have demonstrated competence in certain areas, but I also see a huge number of alliances being built between people who have demonstrated their incompetence. So like school teachers unions, for example. If you look at teachers unions and you look at academic scores in government schools over the last few decades, massive increases in funds, massive decreases in academic results. And you see people circling the wagons around these things because this is literally their bread and butter, like the teachers and the teachers need to do this. But you also see a ton of people coming to their aid for no reason other than they see, I believe, an incompetent people being oppressed for their incompetence.
Yeah.
And they must get on their side.
Yeah. Well, I would speculate, is that decline in scores with the increase in funding due to incompetence, or is it actually due to competence?
Well, so there's the old, never blame on maliciousness what can be blamed on incompetence. I think that it is a little bit of both. There's definitely people who decided that this particular discipline or this particular type of competence is white supremacy or whatever else the buzzword was when they first started doing new math.
Right.
But there's a whole bunch of things like this that I see kind of emerging. And inside of the government, the United States government, we have a lot of people. We have about 24 million government employees in the United States. Now, that's not just the federal government. That is state government.
And local government.
Government.
Teachers, et cetera.
And the federal government isn't huge, but also it's not really clear. Like school teachers make up 11 to 12 million of the employees, and they get a huge, they're local employees, but they get a huge chunk of their budget from the federal budget, and they get a huge amount of their marching orders from the Department of Education and other federal agencies. So it's not purely cut and dried.
Yeah, it's a mix. Like
it's complex.
FEMA is the same way. DHS is the same way. You have a ton of local volunteer and paid firefighters, but a lot of the funding for their equipment comes from the federal government, maybe through state grants or maybe directly.
Yeah, and this is
so it's a mixed bag.
It's a mixed bag, and this is where you start to see that competence-incompetence divide start to develop, because in all of those places, and it's not always federal versus local, but you will have EMS guys who are great at their jobs, and their desire is to be even better at their jobs, even better at saving people, even better at emergency management, even better at whatever. And then you see people who are threatened by that because it makes them look bad, and they kind of retreat into bureaucratic incompetency fortresses. And that happens in the education department, and that happens in a bunch of different spots. So do you also see that, or is this all in my head?
Well, I'm kind of toying with this competency thing, because the question is, those Secret Service agents that
I wasn't
demonstrated
even going to mention them, but yeah, bring
an incredible level of, shall we say, tactical incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
Up until that point, had proven competent at getting onto those details, getting into those positions of authority, getting into the planning positions.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if it's not so much that they're basically incompetent. I wonder if it's that they only care to be competent at something that we don't care about. Right. I wonder if that's more the divide.
And that is something that we see in companies.
Right, because we hire people all the time to come in and do task A.
Yes.
And on paper, they're completely incompetent for the role because they've never done that task before. And holster making is a great example because almost nobody has ever made holsters before we hire them, and they come work here. But they work hard, they become highly skilled, usually in very short order, and then demonstrate a high degree of competence.
Yes.
I know that with my kids, they can be either really good at doing a job, or really bad. And it's not necessarily whether I've trained them. It really comes down to what they want to do.
Yes.
When they decide they want to clean up the kitchen,
right,
it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's something more like that going on where when they decide what we want to be great at is building power, building little fiefdoms within our department.
Yes. Yeah.
Building a career that will last forever. And that's the main thing they focus on. They seem to do a good job at those things.
Yeah.
And they just completely sacrifice things like, guarding people or whatever the product that they're creating.
They prefer the procedures to the outcomes.
Or maybe they prefer their outcomes
right
to the outcome that they're actually supposed to be delivering.
Yeah. And that's why this may not be a helpful split, but I still kind of think that it is, because when we hire people that have never made holsters before, we still are making an assumption like this person is demonstrating competence in broad strokes, and we think that they will be great at holsters because of this other thing. When we look at certain people in business, particularly big businesses and little businesses like T-Rex, everybody can know everybody. Yep. Everybody can know what everybody else's job is. But when you have giant businesses with tens of thousands of people, there are employees that sit in a place where nobody knows if they're doing anything that is helpful, and they draw a paycheck. And I would argue that these people are incompetent at the business of business. They're only good at existing with inside of this procedural morass that exists.
There's this procedural morass is really interesting. I've heard of companies that have specialist teams and their whole job is just to go through the personnel records of the company and like try to figure out, so who is this person and what is it they do? Because sometimes these companies, in the midst of all their reorganizations, you end up with phantom employees with no chain of command.
Right.
Oops. And they're just over here not being given any assignments.
Right.
And they'll just sit on the payroll for years unnoticed. And they'll just happily draw that paycheck. And
that's kind of what I want to get back to.
The good employees who find themselves in that position, like, I have no boss all of a sudden. My 3 levels of bosses above me have all been fired, but I'm still here. Surely someone will come and tell me what to do eventually. Like the good ones would ask questions and get it figured out.
And that they would demonstrate a level of competency as a general principle.
Or maybe it's character.
Regardless of what their actual job or outcomes are.
And then there's these other ones that just are happy to coast for years. And so these specialists do like a kind of forensic accounting, hunt down these rogue, whatever, employees.
Like, and interesting. Yeah.
What's that line from Office Space? We fixed the glitch.
Yeah. You got to fix the glitch. Well, and this is where a lot of, as we look at our own government, 24 million employees, I'm not going to speculate on how many government employees are in this category of accomplishing nothing, building nothing, doing nothing, and drawing a paycheck out of the public coffers. But based on just regular corporate America, I'm going to say the number's pretty high, much higher than anybody would like. But there are few jobs, there are a few groups, there are a few special interest groups, I would say, that are as protected as government workers.
Oh, yeah.
And that are feel as entitled to remuneration for their personal incompetencies as federal employees and government employees in general. And I think that one of the things that starts to come up is it would be easy to understand why competent people would resent the incompetent people drawing the paycheck. What I see happening more and more is I see incompetent people resenting competence in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is this the new, is this going to be a new level or flavor of Marxism that we see in the future? Or is this just a natural thing that happens as people disconnect from reality and disconnect from free market economics? They will take pride in not having a personal level of competence.
I don't know.
Are they fighting against the meritocracy by having no merit?
Because some of these individuals that appear to demonstrate a level of incompetence may not be like really highly incompetent, like all over the place. They may actually be really good at some things, and they're just choosing to behave this way because it serves whatever interests they care about the most. Yep. So I'm not sure if it's competence or something else. But I do see the don't rock the boat, don't mess things up. There's a really interesting example of this when you're talking about protected employees. It used to be the case that the VA, and maybe it applies to other federal agencies as well, have to turn in a report of employees that are on leave and have been accused of felonies.
Seems like a pretty low bar.
And who are on payroll for, I can't remember if it's 2 years or 1 year.
Right.
And there was an instance where a male nurse in the VA physically with his fists beat to death a veteran. And he stayed on payroll up until the day before that reporting deadline.
Right.
Right. So he's in jail, presumably, awaiting trial, but he's on payroll the whole time.
He's on payroll right up until the reporting requirements.
1 day before they have to report to Congress on how many felons they have just hanging out on payroll. And like, what kind of institutional inertia causes that kind of outcome?
Right.
Yeah.
I do think that it's more to it than just Republican versus Democrat.
Right.
It's more than just public sector versus private sector. There is something. There is a tribalism that exists inside of here, and it's probably multi-factored, like all tribal alliances. But I can't shake this feeling that competence versus incompetence is an interesting set of buckets to explore, because this is a guy who is not just bad at his job. He is criminally incompetent, but he is being protected by someone, and it's not an accident, because they knew up until the day.
Well, and the interesting thing is, it wasn't like, oops, that was weird. It's like Congress made a rule.
Yeah.
Like, what happened that caused the creation of that rule? I never dug into it.
Well, government does make a lot of rules just for fun, seems like.
Yeah.
But that is really intriguing.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that is somewhat of a vindication of my harebrained theory that doesn't even have that many notes to back it up. But it's an interesting one to
it's a very interesting thought experiment, because some of what we look at and we're like, oh man, those people are so incompetent. It's like, well, maybe that's what it is. Maybe they're just as dumb as a pile of bricks. Maybe they're actually working on some sort of agenda which makes sense in their paradigm and makes sense with their personal goals. But it's like your job is to do A. And we think your job is to do A, like guard the president, the presidential candidates, whatever. And maybe they think their job is stay in the organization until retirement.
Maintain the largest budget of any similar
or whatever.
agency.
Like, advance my personal career.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that's their job in their eyes.
Sure. Yeah. And I would still argue that there's got to be a way where we can say that if your only output, if your only outcomes, if you're the only fruit that you bore as a employee or as the head of an agency is that you grew your budget and you stayed in a long time and there was no other measurable component of positivity or benefit, I would still call that incompetency, even though that guy did an amazing job of hanging on, growing his budget.
Of doing that thing.
Yeah. Keeping his criminally negligent dudes on until the very last minute and not getting in trouble with the congressional oversight committees.
Where's
that requires a fair amount of engagement.
Where's the parable about the shrewd steward in the Gospels? Do you remember off the top of your head? Because there's a steward and he's not doing a great job. So his master says, come, you must give an account for yourself. So he quickly takes the ledgers and he takes the creditors and so like, here, change your account to say you don't owe 200 widgets, you owe 50 widgets.
Yeah.
And he
by favor with all of the debtors.
Right. Yeah. So like, and his master, what was it? He recognized the shrewdness of this steward, and he acted in a very self-serving way.
Yeah.
He was incompetent as a steward, but he was very competent at looking out for his own interests.
Yes. As an opportunist
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I still think there's going to be some tension though, because guys who are shrewd personal opportunists will not get along with people who are competent in other ways.
Yeah.
There will be tension.
Yeah. I don't know. I need to think about this more.
Yeah, I was like, that's a weird
I feel
thought.
like that's a great place to leave many conversations. You don't have to no, we have arrived at the definitive solution and this is it.
Yeah.
Podcasts are supposed to be more like essays, right? Where you play with an idea and you look at it from different perspectives and angles, and it's not necessarily meant to be the final word for all time.
Well, that is actually a good point, because occasionally there are T-Rex videos where a subject has been thoroughly explored and a conclusion is delivered in the video, but podcasts have traditionally, for us, been places where we start a conversation and hand it over to the listeners to continue to noodle and do the research. So this is probably a good one for that. Like, as you look out at the world and you see conflict, Republican versus Democrat, white versus apparently everybody else, the media versus competence, you start to wonder about some of these different things in corporate media. It is pretty fascinating to watch things like, say, I don't know, Disney owning Star Wars. And running it into the ground and nobody being held accountable. And there really is no course change. There's just make terrible shows and then don't renew them because the ratings are bad. But don't stop making terrible shows. Just keep doing that for a while. So there is this, and right now, because the Acolyte it didn't get canceled. It failed to be renewed for a second season. But everyone's talking about how tyrannical it was that it was canceled by people who hate it, and how terrible it is that other shows got better ratings.
The world is so wrong.
So that feels like another competent versus incompetent conversations. Now, they've tried to make that conversation about everything. Race, sexual agenda, toxicity of male fans versus every label under the sun has been applied to that show and the reason why it wasn't received the way that it was supposed to be received. But it also feels like competence versus incompetence, because it is a definitively poorly written show with acting that is cringeworthy.
I don't know. I haven't seen
I'm afraid that I watched some of the episodes because there was a clip that I was looking for and I found the clip, but it was
Mystery Science Fiction Theater worthy.
No, it was too flat to be fun to make fun of.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah. So it was one of those things where you couldn't even enjoy what is it? It's called. No, you couldn't even enjoy hate watching it. There wasn't anything to even really laugh at.
It was just too bland.
Yeah,
it was lukewarm.
It was lukewarm, and it was predictably bad. It was this is a coven of witches because the patriarchy hates witches. These will be the heroes because we're trying to make a point. They weren't trying to explore a new fun Star Wars thing. They were trying to dredge up imagery from the Crucible and classic feminism and, classic old school 20th century identity politics. And it was done in an incompetent way. So I see this divide happening, and I see the divide getting worse. And when that happens, whether it is employer-employee, rich-poor, when there is this huge disparity, it's really hard to, A, reconcile things, and really bad stuff usually comes out of it. It's kind of like in science, a serious temperature disparity. Right. There's a lot of potential energy in a temperature disparity. You can generate energy using a vast difference between hot and cold areas, or you can pour boiling water into a cold glass and it will shatter.
Yeah. So if we take your thought experiment about incompetency and competency as a framework to look at the world, the second logical thought experiment is for individuals to do on themselves, which is, where am I personally competent and where am I personally incompetent? And I'm going to kind of define it as competency is capability and results.
Yep.
Right? So I'm putting those two together.
I am deeply incompetent in a lot of areas, but carry on.
So I know very little about fixing cars, and I am 100% okay with that. It is not my life purpose or my life mission to know how to pop the hood on my car and change out the headlight fluid or whatever. And I'm okay with that. I would very much like to be competent as a parent, right? And as a husband. And I guess the second question then is, if you were to ask your friends, hey, what do you think I'm really competent at? And what do you think I'm not competent at? Like where I have capability and I have results to show for it. That would be an interesting sort of self-examination experiment for people to go through. And then they could think about, like, is this really where I want to be headed in life? I'm known as a really competent amateur golfer or whatever. Like, is that really the most important thing in life? Kids would probably make kids would latch onto this real fast. Yeah. My kids could tell me really fast, Dad, you're really good at this, and you're not good at this.
Right. And we're not trying to find just another dividing line to draw in a fuzzy gray. There's no good or evil. There's only different opinions. We have to come back to there being a standard of right and wrong. And I don't think you just boil down numerically, like, I am good at things that are right and I am bad at things that are wrong necessarily.
Oh, no, not at all. Because there's all kinds of things that are great things. It's just maybe it's not my thing.
Sure. But what if you were, say, for example, somebody who was the showrunner on The Acolyte, and it turned out that you were bad at writing scripts and you were bad at running shows and you were bad at making money and you were really only good at being an assistant to Harvey Weinstein? Like, would that be...
That's just terrible. And that's where you look at that and go, like, is this who I want to be as a person? And if the answer is yes, this is who I want to be as a person, well, that's kind of between you and God. And
apparently not very many Star Wars fans.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. Interesting thought experiment.
Yeah. I was going to write a really deeply insightful monologue, but I wanted to kick it around a little bit more, and I found the perfect person to do it with.
Yeah.
So as you look at the world and all the different historical divisions, this one is appearing to come about kind of accidentally. I don't see a new communist manifesto that hates competent people per se, but it's not that different than hating rich people. Now, it's much easier, let's say the Jacobins, to say, we hate these rich people, not because they're really good at starting businesses, but because they've inherited this wealth. But now we're getting to the point where we hate people who started businesses from scratch. We hate people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. We hate people who educated themselves. And they have some privilege that came from somewhere. But we really, really dislike people who are free thinkers.
Right.
And demonstrating effectiveness, measurable effectiveness somewhere.
Was it Pol Pot that killed the glasses wearers?
Yes.
I think it was.
A number of people were anti-intellectuals, but he was someone who said glasses equals intellectualism.
Right. And it wasn't. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting. I think it was it intellectualism or was it education?
Good question.
I can't remember.
We would probably need to know the actual Cambodian language, which words they centered in on. But there's been Mao definitely opposed intellectualism and the older generation that had been educated in the old ways.
Right.
Specifically. But Pol Pot getting down to just glasses wearers. It's a great incompetent demonstration of incompetent classification right there.
Right.
Yeah. So we will see probably this continue to develop because even just related to the presidential, I don't know, are they campaigns? Are either of the presidential candidates running proper campaigns? Kamala Harris.
They're running improper campaigns.
They're running improper campaigns. Kamala Harris is almost as invisible as when Joe Biden was locked in his basement during his last campaign.
That's, the basement strategy she seems to be using to a T.
Yeah.
Which I find really interesting. And the second part of the basement strategy that she's employing, the first part is hide in the basement. The second part is you're running against Trump's presidency. So her talking points are almost like, from the little bit I've seen of them, it's almost like she's running against Trump immediately prior to having been president and not she's been VP for the last 4 years.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very interesting. It's like they literally just dusted off the binders from 4 years ago and let's.
Oh no, it's exactly.
Since it worked so well last time, let's do it again.
It is exactly the same. I'm watching celebrities like Ben Stiller said, it's time to vote Kamala Harris in because it's time for a change. And it's like, a change from what? She's been in the White House for a little while now, and the same handlers that ran Joe Biden are running her.
If we want to change, let's see, we had 2 terms of Obama, 1 term of Trump, 1 term of Biden. That appears to be 75% Democrat.
Yeah.
Right? So is that the change?
It is pretty much the exact same the play. So here's a question now on this topic of competency versus incompetency. Ooh. Is this a demonstration of great competency because it worked 4 years ago? Or is this them virtue signaling to their base? Is this an incompetent presidential campaign that's a dog whistle to people who appreciate incompetence because that's the camp that they're in?
I think that there's a level of competence where they recognize there are very, very, very few swing votes left, and they could literally run, a corpse or Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And people would vote for him, and he was the greatest candidate ever.
They locked him in a basement. And he still got more votes than any president in American history.
And then he was the greatest candidate ever, up until he wasn't, with the night of long knives, whatever we should call that. When the night of the debate, when the media just pivoted on a dime, which was coordinated clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were in lockstep.
Yeah.
My theory is that they were all set. They're like, we know this debate is going to happen, and it's probably going to be a disaster.
So now you've actually shot a big hole in my theory because
I'm saying there's a degree of competency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joe Biden demonstrated that he was an incompetent debater, even against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And an incredibly competently organized campaign was instantly run against him. So obviously there's a high level of competence at some level inside of the corporate media that celebrates incompetence, but is more organized than I retract my previous theory.
Your previous theory? Well, you may not need to retract it entirely, but this is where it's like they're competent at what? Maybe we look at it and we go, they're incompetent. And it's like, no, they're just very competent at doing something completely different than we would think that they should be doing.
Right.
Right. And so I think that may be where some of this comes down.
Yeah.
There are people in the world that are, for whatever reason, truly and comprehensively incompetent. And it's very, very sad. Those people, I don't think they end up climbing the ladders of power. There's a kind of competence required to climb the greasy pole.
Right.
You must have whatever hardware it takes to climb that pole. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or whatever drive or willingness to work hard for it. You don't, with very few exceptions, you don't seem to fail to the top.
No,
That's
you have to bring something to the table. But I do think that there is a capillary effect that pulls truly incompetent people into the middle management, or just sort of the middle of the pile. To where that they can still draw a paycheck for 2 years after beating somebody to death.
So you remember in Yes Minister, the British comedy show about politics.
Yes. Highly recommended.
Yes. The interesting thing is, in that show, which purports to be a semi-realistic depiction of how British politics works, Jim Hacker is picked to be the next prime minister, basically, because they actually want an incompetent figurehead that's easy to
They would
push
like
around.
a manipulatable puppet.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I don't know.
As all things, it's easy to draw black and white lines, but ultimately there's so many black and white lines close together that things look gray.
See, and I think this is why when we see things like revolutions around the world or whatever, they tend to not land on really niche ideological lines. It tends to be something that's really easy to see and point out, like skin color, how much money you have, or what church you go to.
Yeah.
Those seem to be the lines that most commonly get dusted off and used.
Yeah. It is true.
Yeah.
I see highly incompetent people as pretty easy to identify, and ridiculously competent people as easy to identify. And then there's normal people that lean one way or the other in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's usually a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to organize your revolution against. But there is a general feeling, I believe, that there's a bunch of people who know that they are not high achievers, and they want to be part of a giant democratic morass of safety nets and universal basic income and entertainment and bread and circuses.
Yeah.
And anyone who is a serious go-getter, who is really good at stuff,
Right.
is kind of a threat.
A term that I've kind of used instead of competent, incompetent is high-performing individuals and low-performing individuals. And they just don't seem to, and that very much focuses on what they're accomplishing. And there are these people that they just don't seem to want to accomplish very much.
Right. Tall poppy syndrome.
So in New Zealand, there's this.
Yeah, explain how.
Yeah, so I've never seen this, but apparently in poppy fields, if the poppies are all growing and one poppy grows taller than the others, somehow the others squelch and destroy that one tall poppy.
The roots get choked out because it spent more of its energy growing up and less building the root system.
Yeah, and so it dies. And so all the poppies in the poppy field are the exact same level. Well, in New Zealand, when they have this thing, I think they have it in Australia and the UK as well, that they call tall poppy syndrome, where there's if there's an individual that is trying to be a higher performing individual or a higher achiever than everyone else, there's kind of this.
You're letting the side down.
And there's kind of a joy in pulling that person down. He doesn't deserve to be any more different or better than anyone else. And so there's kind of this joy in tearing him down and getting him down to his proper level.
And there are exceptions to this. In sports, you're allowed to be a high performer.
Yes.
Peter Jackson made movies that made New Zealand look so good that he was allowed to be a high performer.
Right.
But I can think of a lot of folks who...
they would kind of get squelched and stifled and
other cultures have a
mocked or whatever.
Yeah, different term for it. It's like crabs in a bucket. Like when you have a bunch of crabs in a bucket and one starts to escape, the other crabs do not cheer him on. They grab his feet and pull him back into the bucket. And that is a thing that you can see happen in a lot of communist countries, actually.
Yep.
With the tip lines and the ratting and the
interesting.
So on, and with crabs, that is not malicious. The crabs are just blindly grabbing at whatever they can. They don't know that
they don't have some deep agenda.
Right. But competence is, if you are threatened by competence, then incompetence can be weaponized against it. I know that we talk about everything being weaponized because we're a weapons company, but everything can be weaponized.
Yes.
And incompetence.
Anything is a weapon if you try hard enough.
Yes, Jackie Chan taught us that, and it's true. So incompetence is sometimes, it isn't just incompetence by itself. It is attached to malevolence. And let's talk about the government schools again real quick. If a nation, let's just talk about the lottery.
Yeah.
Let's say you were a state.
Yep.
And you made a lot of money selling lottery tickets to people who didn't know math.
Right.
Would it be in your best interests to have the best math teachers and the highest math scores?
No.
Now think about literally everything else in the country. If you, as a bureaucrat class, say, were dependent upon people being elected who would build up your budgets and lower your standards and expectations, would it serve you to have teachers that teach really important, hard lessons and require competence of the students?
Right. No, you'd probably want the dumbest population you could get your hands on.
Right.
And that's where, when I look at the schools, is like, is this really abysmal academic performance that we see in many areas? Is this because the teachers are just bad teachers? Or is this because the people creating the curriculums and stuff like that and creating what they're doing in the schools and then giving that to the teachers, they're kind of intentionally creating a system that will result in very politically correct students that definitely don't know how to think. You should insert here the picture of the perfect soldier. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yes, with no head.
The guy with no head. Yes, finally, a perfect soldier.
Yes.
Right. I think that's more what they're looking for.
Right. And I think that actually that's the area we're going to see a lot more of this divide, where as the school choice conversation continues to happen in different states.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to, you can see the teachers' unions being threatened by schools that have better scores.
Yes.
Teachers who are clearly, demonstrably more competent at teaching students. And they're going to make schools this fuzzy celebration of incompetence. That's the thing that needs the money.
Yeah.
Not a conversation about actual academic capability or efficiency of dollars or anything that is tied back to competency. We're going to see more emphasis on joy and more emphasis on decency and more emphasis on community feel-goodness as opposed to anything that's measurable.
Yep.
So I guess my theory is back on the table. I reinstate my theory as something that is worth thinking about and probably actually has some merit. So as you continue to watch the election stuff unfold, that is a new set of buckets that you can start to put things in and think through. And I'm curious what you guys have to say about that in the comments.
Yeah. And definitely give thought to what kind of competency you are cultivating in yourself, and whether that really aligns with your long-term goals and what you believe you should be doing in life.
Thank you very much for watching that episode. If you listened to it, I am really curious to know what you think over on YouTube. YouTube is a better place for comments. It's more interactive. We can actually get your input on the episode much easier than the kind of podcasting where you just download the MP3 file. And I really like those days, but more interaction with you is good. And being able to see each other's faces, well, no, that's still pretty one way. Anyway, check us out on YouTube if you're not already over here and leave a comment because it is going to be the best way for us to interact going into the future.